Excellent journalist, Judy Woodruff, who is going to serve as the moderator for the debate. Judy is senior correspondent and often co-anchor of the Newshour on PBS, which is anchored just across the river. She was with NBC and CNN, a big award-winning journalist, and founding co-chair of the International Women's Media Foundation. So I'm going to hand it over to Judy. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob, very much. Can everybody hear? I just want to make sure sounds good, and welcome all of you. I am delighted to be here this afternoon. I'm glad to be part of this fascinating conference. Glad for two reasons. First of all, because it's very hard to say no to my friend Bob Borston. And second of all, when the lead news story is the continuing Euro crisis, as it is today, I just thought a lighter topic like internet freedom would be a nice break. And so that's another reason. No, but in all seriousness, as everybody knows, the United States is the birthplace of the internet, home to the world's largest tech companies, and it has a government with considerable international influence. American-designed platforms like YouTube and Twitter, as we know, played crucial roles in organizing citizens during the Arab Spring. Meanwhile, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton has broken new ground by making internet freedom a priority foreign policy goal of the United States. At the same time, many around the world, ranging from heads of state to independent bloggers, question the motives and the meaning behind U.S. policy. They note that some U.S. companies are exporting technologies that enable repressive regimes to spy on their own citizens, and that others comply with national laws that violate the spirit of what Secretary Clinton is talking about. Commentators have also questioned whether the U.S. risks a backlash by publicly advocating for internet freedom in parts of the world where Washington's every move comes under a microscope. With influence that far surpasses its share of global internet users, what is the right role for United States institutions in the public and the private sectors in the effort to promote internet freedom outside U.S. borders? Are these institutions helping information to flow freely across national borders, or has the United States gone too far in its quest to do the right thing? Well, to discuss these and other questions, we are so fortunate to be joined by an outstanding panel, and I'm going to introduce them to you now, and then they are each going to make opening remarks. To my right, to your left, is Dunja Mijatovic. She's the representative on freedom of the media for the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Next to her is Mohammad I'm sorry, Sunil. We were seated differently. Here we go. Sunil Abraham is the executive director of the Delhi-based Center for Internet and Society. To my left, to your right, is Mohammad El-Dashan. He is an award-winning writer and journalist and international development consultant based in Cairo and Tunis. And finally, Cynthia Wong. She is the director of the Project on Global Internet Freedom at the Washington-based Center for Democracy and Technology. So we are going to hear from each one of these panelists. They're going to talk for about 5 minutes each. I'm then going to ask them a few questions to get the discussion going. They will, if they want to, pose some questions to one another. And then for the final 30 minutes, and we're going to go until 3 o'clock, we've got a pretty sharp cutoff time, we're going to open it up for questions from all of you. So please be thinking about what you would like to ask. But let's begin with the opening statements, and Cynthia Wong, you're first.
Great. Fantastic. Thank you so much. I kind of want to start actually by pivoting away from the term internet freedom for a couple of different reasons. I think it makes a really good brand for building support and promoting the U.S. government's message, but it's become a term that basically means whatever the speaker wants it to mean. I don't know that there is kind of a common understanding of what internet freedom actually means. And I think it's important to acknowledge that in some parts of the world, what internet freedom really means is only so far as what the US government is willing to do consistent with its interests. And I think we just need to acknowledge that perception. And instead, I want to situate the term internet freedom more firmly within the frame of established universal human rights norms. And I think that within that frame, all governments, including the US government, do have a duty to protect human rights, to protect freedom of expression, assembly, association, privacy, et cetera. And that means that the US government does have a duty to assess its laws and its practices through a human rights lens, to assess their proportionality and their necessity in a democratic society. So I think in that way, one of the most important ways for the US government to protect human rights in the internet age is really to set the right example at home. And that is because the inconvenient truth is that the US government still is seen very much as a leader for internet regulation. Many governments still look to the US for models for how to deal with very legitimate and challenging and sometimes maybe not so legitimate policy issues. And so whether we're dealing with how to protect national security, cybersecurity, copyright enforcement, the protection of children, or whatever the policy issue is, I think the US government, in talking through its own domestic policy, needs to be prepared for other countries who might emulate our approach. And I think it really requires some sober consideration for the notion that if our approach to domestic policy is emulated by a wide range of states, what does that mean for the global network? And I will come out of the abstract and go into the concrete and give one example here from the SOPA-PIPA debates from earlier this year, which I think everyone in this room was probably pretty familiar with. But in particular, we raised a lot of concerns around the DNS blocking provisions. They were proposed in SOPA and PIPA as a copyright enforcement mechanism, because we argued that if that mechanism was emulated by a wide range of states, not only for copyright, but for whatever legitimate or illegitimate policy interests those states might have, then we would really perhaps see a real fracturing of the global internet, and that actually really directly undermines some of the stated US foreign policy goals in this area. So if I can summarize with one organizing principle, it really is that internet freedom begins at home. I think the second set of thoughts I wanted to offer just as framing thoughts is about the role of the private sector. I mean, as we know, many of the multinational companies and the tools that we use every day, a lot of them are based in the US. And so even though governments have traditionally had the primary duty for protecting human rights, both offline and online, I think what's really changed in the internet age is that the tools that we're using now to exercise a range of human rights are now often owned and operated by non-state actors, by the private sector. And there's several important implications of this shift. First, I think that governments are increasingly looking to these actors to play the role of law enforcement. They're saying these intermediaries, these companies that have access to lots of user data and who are well positioned to block or censor content, they really should have a greater role in policing bad behavior online. But when companies take on the role of law enforcement, it does raise some serious issues around due process, around the rule of law, and around accountability when human rights are harmed associated with those activities. And I think it also raises questions around what duty do multinational corporations have to their users, especially when they're asked by governments to act in ways that are inconsistent with universal human rights norms. So there's a second organizing principle I would put forward is this, that with great power comes great responsibility, even with non-state actors like companies. And I will say that there's actually a growing body of norms that are now being developed that help define what it means for companies to meet their human rights responsibility in this area. First starting with the work of the UN Special Representative John Ruggie on business and human rights, and now being continued with organizations like the Global Network Initiative. And it's things like companies need to really think about how to avoid complicity in human rights violations. And there's really, I think, a responsibility on companies to actively assess the human rights risk that might flow from their business operations, from the products and services that they're offering around the world, and really act actively to mitigate that risk. The final thought I would offer is that even in the absence of government pressure on companies to take certain actions to censor, to violate privacy, I think that the policies companies themselves put in place, sometimes for purely commercial reasons, can also impact our ability to exercise rights in the internet age. And I think it's incumbent on companies to start thinking through when they develop their privacy policies or their real name registration policies or content moderation policies for their platforms, how much are they actually thinking about the global user base that their services are now being utilized by in order to exercise fundamental human rights? And I think that's another thing that I think we need to develop further when talking about the role of companies. So.
Okay, Cynthia, thank you very much. Mohammad El-Dashan.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here among such a distinguished panel. You mentioned the speech by Hillary Clinton. It was interesting that one of the early speeches she made about internet freedom was actually here at the museum in January 2010. I thought it was interesting that 2 years later we're kind of debating where this is going. And I think that when she was speaking about, well, developing internet freedom in the world, she didn't realize that a lot of it, when we think about internet freedom abroad, essentially, we think about how we change the policies abroad, how that country censors its own users, etc. We don't really think of the impact of what happens here on users in the rest of the world. Two incidents in the recent months, I guess, were very telling in how users outside of the United States relate to what happens here. One of them, as you mentioned, the SOPA and PIPA, where we think about the protests, really. And a lot of the protests here are about, well, write to your congressman. And for us in the rest of the world, where, we don't have a congressman. We knew what it felt to be like a Washington, D.C. resident. But all we could do was support. Really the protests that were happening here. What to some websites abroad also blacked out their websites in solidarity with websites in the US, etc. But for the rest of us, we were kind of watching what was happening. The other is the incidents that Renata Vila mentioned yesterday about the WikiLeaks investigation, how a court issued a secret subpoena to Twitter requesting private details about a number of users. Some of them are abroad. And of course, that brings up the question of, well, okay, so they can do that. They can request data about other users abroad. They can do that secretly. It's very possible that they did that with other companies. Not necessarily Twitter, because when you think of it, Twitter isn't the biggest repository of personal data on users. So what's the case for, so if you think of it from a foreign user, if you're a foreign activist, and all your data is stored on a US server with a US company, and you think of, well, is it possible that my country, my home country, which is an autocratic country, would possibly send a friendly request to the United States to disclose information about me as a user? And what does that practically means in terms of personal safety for users abroad? So that's I guess that's my first point. How we have come to realize that. The second point I would like to make is, well, that was local policies. How the policies devised in the U.S. by the U.S. government and U.S. companies vis-a-vis the rest of the world impact us as users. Now, until yesterday, users in Syria could not download Google Chrome because apparently, that would be against the sanctions. So that would somehow prop up the Syrian regime, where at the same time Blue Coat is selling surveillance equipment to Syria. Now, what we also know, we spoke about Blue Coat in Syria, but we don't talk about Blue Coat selling the same kind of equipment to the UAE and to Bahrain, right? So when you think of it, policy devised in the US by the government and by companies seem to be discriminating somehow between allies and non-allies. Right? On that, I'll refer you to a very interesting map that was on the Freedom House that was actually on the screens going around. A very interesting map by the Freedom House it's a Middle East map, and it says which company sells surveillance equipment to where. So I'll refer you to that. It's very, very interesting. And that's one thing. Another set of laws that are devised in the US and have an impact abroad are how terrorism laws mean that companies in a place like Palestine cannot, for instance, sell their services abroad. It's an upcoming report by the World Bank that talks about small and medium enterprises and micro enterprises that are trying to do business on the internet. And part of the reason why they are unable to do that is because U.S. anti-terrorism laws forbids companies like PayPal and others to do that. So the simple thing of making it impossible for a small business somewhere to receive a payment for their business is severely curtailed by U.S. regulations. And the last thing is, well, regulations done by companies themselves. And then it becomes a little more difficult to pinpoint because there's little information available about this. But if you look at something like the Google Transparency Report, now, okay, so their website lists the number of requests of content removal and requests of user information disclosure, and I thought it was interesting to see the breakdown of countries. Now, most of the user data disclosure requests came from OECD countries, not from authoritarian countries, according to the website. That I thought was a little surprising. The other section, which is about requests to remove content, it looked like Google tends to comply with requests coming from developed countries more than they did from developing countries. Not a single request coming from Pakistan was answered, whereas, say, 80% of requests coming from the United States or from the UK were complied with. So so when we look about internet freedom and what the US does, it's very important to look at what they do inside, what they do outside, and how that impacts the rest of the world. Thank you. I'm a little over time. I apologize.
Oh, that's terrific. Thank you. All right, Dunja Mijatovic.
I'm delighted to be here. I also have a little anecdote with Bob. He invited me to take part in this panel. I saw the title, and then I realized, oh my God, what am I going to say in relation to this topic? But then, of course, as you said it already, John, I couldn't say no to Bob. I decided to tackle the very controversial topic that we are discussing today, but also to use this opportunity to ask several other questions that I think are very much relevant to this topic. As Cynthia already pointed out, freedom is, in a way, freedom in general, not just internet freedom, is a loaded term. And it holds very rhetorical power. And I think that many scholars, many people discussing internet rhetorically all agree that and support that internet freedom is extremely important. But when we actually look at the examples and everything that is happening around the world, then we also have to realize that freedom means quite different things in different parts of the world, and it carries diverse weights when measured against other interests in several countries. And those countries are countries I'm working together with my team. The OSCE region is 56 participating states, but this is not about one region. This is about the whole world. And in a way, if we ask the question, what is the responsibility of the US government, at the same time, I would ask the question, what is the responsibility of the international organizations in relation to this? Because I do not see freedoms online different than freedoms offline. And I would also ask the question, what are several countries not doing that are part of the international organizations and they sign voluntarily to agree on the issues that are so important to all of us, and here I'm talking about fundamental freedoms. And in my view, this is a struggle that needs a joint effort. This is not something that we can expect US to do for all of us around the world. This is a struggle that needs like-minded countries like Sweden, like the Netherlands, and many other around the world that are truly dedicated in order to enable their citizens to have free and safe internet at the same time. I would also like to mention the attempts by the governments. As we speak, we can see that several governments, and too many, in my view, are trying to use international organizations in order to start regulating internet. Yesterday, we were hearing about ITU. At the moment, my office pays enormous attention to what is happening under the roof of this organization. And last year, there was an attempt by several countries to introduce information code and to give UN possibility to become a big brother regulating internet for all UN member states. And this is continuing. There was another attempt recently by Kazakhstan introducing cyber police. And all these attempts and all these ideas will be discussed, I'm sure, under the ITU logo. So that's why even with the knowledge that consensus-based, like my organization cannot do much, there is a need to open up and to let in the civil society NGOs in order to look at these issues from different perspectives. Because in a way, I think that many of the organizations, many governments, they are playing with a toy that they are really not very much aware of. Which kind of effect the introduction of the laws can have on freedoms online, but at the same time on freedom offline. So in a way, what I see almost on a daily basis is that certain governments are trying to introduce what we just have, several floors below us, walls, but this time these walls are not concrete walls that we have here, reminding all of us about the history and about those horrible events that happened. But what they are trying to do is build these electronic curtains or electronic walls, regionettes, so-called regionettes, in order to protect their societies of the evil. And this is something that I think can be pursued and can be tackled, and not only by one government, no matter how responsible this government, because of the innovations and the great issues that happened here in relation to the internet, but there is a need for much more involvement.
Wonderful. And finally, Sunil Abraham.
Thank you. I'm going to sound a bit like a hijacker on an aeroplane. I have a list of demands. I have.
Yeah, please don't do that.
I have 6 demands for the U.S. government and 3 demands for the U.S. companies. But I'll start with the U.S. Government because I find it rather distasteful that we refer to these companies as U.S. companies. They're already so full of Indians that can you really call them U.S. companies? Starting with demand number 1, recognize that access to knowledge is part of freedom of expression. Most people, including myself, cannot distinguish between aggressive enforcement of unbalanced/outdated intellectual property law and censorship. It looks exactly the same to us, and you sound hypocritical when you say this. Demand number 2, don't lose the moral high ground. Other countries are waiting to cherry pick from your worst practice. Nitin Pai, who is an expert at the policy think tank in New Delhi, says, thank God that the US dominates internet governance. Just imagine what would happen if Indians dominated internet governance. The US courts and US civil society do a much better job in protecting civil liberties worldwide. So let us continue letting them do what they do rather well. So please don't lose the moral high ground. Demand number 3, recognize that freedom of expression is a trade issue. I took Susan's colleague from the Global Network Initiative, David, to the Consortium of Indian Industry and asked them whether Indian telcos would be interested in signing the GNI principles. And they said to me, why don't you ask the US government to give Indian telcos access to the US market, or make it easier for Indian telcos to enter the US market, and then we will talk about freedom of expression. So asymmetric trade negotiations have been happening for quite some time, and perhaps it's the US that started it, and what comes around goes around. 4, support actions that address developing country anxieties. For example, supply chain audits of telecommunication equipment. The US wishes away problems or deals with problems by banning the import of equipment. The US knows for sure that there are no backdoors in its telecommunication equipment leaking secrets to the Chinese government because it bans the use of Huawei equipment. But many other governments across the world have to use Huawei equipment, and we don't know whether we can trust the US equipment or even Scandinavian equipment. So therefore, we need best practices here, greater transparency in how these technologies are put together. Demand number 5, understand the importance of nomenclature. Freedom and liberty might work perfectly here in the US, but in other countries, perhaps we need different terms. Openness may be appropriate in another country. And my last demand for the government, 6, is don't be too instrumental in your interventions. It undermines the local credibility of those people that you're trying to support. I had a phone call from the US Embassy saying that we would like to offer you a fellowship, a freedom of expression fellowship, where we take you to the US for a visit, where you will get to meet experts and have conversations, etc. I said, I'll have to check with the Home Ministry. I travel already so much that my wife, which is the Home Ministry, objects to my foreign travel. And then the woman from the US Embassy said, oh, that's no problem. We'll buy a ticket for your wife as well. But if word gets around that Sunil Abraham, defender of internet freedom in India, is taking his wife to the US on junkets, supported by the US government, labeled explicitly freedom of expression, this is not going to help with my credibility. I had 3 demands for the companies, but it doesn't look like I will be able to make all of them. So I will just make one, which is be polite. When Google argues its case at the Delhi Magistrates Court, the Google lawyer told the judge, I don't think you know or fully appreciate that we have freedom of expression in this country. This type of condescending remarks to the judiciary doesn't really help your cause. Being polite in certain jurisdictions goes a long way. So I'll end there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sunil. We're going to come to the audience in about 9 or 10 minutes, but during that time, I'm going to ask a couple of questions, and you can all ask each other. I want to get the other 3 panelists to react to what we just heard from Sunil. Advice to the U.S., Cynthia, he said, don't lose the moral ground, recognize access to knowledge is the point of freedom of expression. What's your take on what he said, advice to the U.S. government? Or demand, demand the U.S. government.
I agree is the short answer. I mean, I do think, again, it's really about setting the right example to make sure that you can then, through diplomatic channels, through trade or whatever mechanisms, then push for practices that are also consistent with human rights abroad. And so I think that's really important. And I mean, I think Sunil's point about access to knowledge and incorporating that into the thinking around copyright enforcement and freedom of expression, I think that's really important to consider. And it's not really part of the dialogue here in the US as much. And one of the things that we watch happening all around the world that we worry about a little bit is selective export of various parts of US policy without exporting the full framework, right? So selective export of very strong copyright enforcement without also exporting some of the safeguards that we have in the US that may not exist in other countries can have some pretty unintended consequences that could be very negative for both access to knowledge and free expression. So I think that's just another example of ways in which the US government needs to be very aware of the way it uses rhetoric and the way that it interacts with other states in promoting better internet policies.
Mohamed, you want to comment on that and comment on what Sunil said, his demands?
All right, well, first, I mean, it's important to point out that the guy on the panel who's hijacking the plane is not the Arab. So that would be my first point.
I didn't know I was going to be with a group of comedians. That's great.
The second point, I guess, I mean, I was listening to your points, and I think that they're very pertinent, and I think, you know, they all come under the 2 points of 1, be humble, and 2, don't be a hypocrite. It seems to me like these are like the underlying themes of your demands. And in both cases, I completely agree. Be consistent about what you do everywhere. So a lot of great ideas come out from here. It's sad that the application goes bad for rhetoric, among other things. Yeah, that's essentially my first reaction to his points.
Dunja?
I also agree with Sunil. What else can I say? And I think he wrapped it up perfectly and so interesting for all of us. But what you mentioned about best practices and the way that the US government should really pay attention which kind of implication and how anything that is happening here we are talking, of course, about internet freedom, has an impact and result in some faraway parts of the world is something that is a great responsibility for this government. And I do not think it's only here that sometimes people live in some kind of bubble and they do not have feeling, what is happening in some really faraway parts of the world. But it's also in Europe. I'm here talking about European Union and, some countries that actually have this privilege to live in safe and free environment, enjoying privileges, technological, and all these sort of issues that are so important for all of us. But then if you think about Belarus, if you think about Central Asia, if you think how anything happening here and in some other parts of the world is having an impact, then we need to be more careful, all of us, not just the US government, but all of us working in order to pursue more freedom and to defend people that are trying to here I'm talking about bloggers and social media activists that are trying to present the views using this wonderful technology.
Well, before we move to corporations, I do want to ask each one of you just to say, just to put a fine point on this, what is it that the U.S. government should do? If you take what Secretary of State Clinton said, what should the United States government do to get to this goal of internet freedom as fast as possible, advancing the cause, doing as much as possible? What would you like to see? Sunil?
I would still stick by what I said. I think it's mostly about leading through example, because there is constant policy laundering. At the moment, I sit on a committee that is producing the white paper that precedes the draft privacy bill in India, and we look towards the European Union and to US law, for example, on how these rights can be protected. So I would just stick to what I've said, lead through example.
What would you add, Cynthia?
I think the only other thing I would highlight, other than lead by example, is something that I think Dunja touched on already, which is I think the U.S. government needs to help build a broader coalition of governments who are committed to human rights, committed to making sure that citizens can fully exercise the full range of human rights in the
You don't
internet
think that's
age.
happened so far?
I think it's beginning to happen, and I think those efforts are underway, but I just want to emphasize the importance of this being a broad base of governments all saying in one voice, international human rights applies with as much force online as it does off.
Mohamed?
Well, I think how we can best achieve that goal. It seems to me there are two main alleys of intervention. One is the high-level government to government. So talk to governments is definitely the first thing that crossed my mind. How you talk to governments, how do you talk to other governments, also very important. And one of the benefits of coming at the end of the conference is that you heard so many great ideas. One of them that comes up is what Sana Salim was talking about yesterday, is that it's address the economic benefit of internet freedom when you're talking to other governments. I kind of stole that point from Carl, who reminded me of that. So talk to governments. Change your rhetoric according to which government. So that's the one level. The other level, when we talk about internet freedom, is address users. And if you're addressing users, the best way of being in touch with users, let's say, around the world, probably I won't pick up a phone call from the US government as an activist, let's say, but there are some fantastic private organizations doing really good work when it comes to internet freedom. Think EFF and Tor and all those fabulous people helping people in autocratic government, under autocratic regimes access the internet. So we need to think of that dual approach, government and user.
And Dunja?
I will just mention the coalition building around the US, and as Cynthia said, this is already happening. And the coalition was actually established in The Hague in December last year. The Dutch government started, Secretary of State was there. There was also a Google event organized a day before. And many of the countries that are participating states of the OSCE are members of this coalition. Recently, I heard that Costa Rica joined, Mongolia. So there is an effort in order to find a way to emphasize the importance of free internet. And I do not think, as I said at the beginning, is something for one government or one organization. It's a joint struggle in order to in a way, impose the importance of this topic, because I do not think that international policymakers are discussing internet freedom as a part of their talks about security, copyright. I mean, there were so many things that happened recently here in the United States that proved that. But then the reaction of the civil society, of citizens, of netizens, as we call them, was something which I think should be welcomed and should be used as a good example that active civil society can influence the government and can change the direction that is not good for freedom.
Okay, some of you have already raised this, but before we go to audience questions in just a couple of minutes, I just want each of you to spend a minute on this question of the private sector, and with two different questions. One, what is the role of U.S. corporations that create platforms? Do they have a moral obligation to promote free expression, or on the other hand, should they avoid getting involved in these political issues? And second, what about those U.S. firms that build filtering technology? Should they be allowed, permitted, to send that abroad to repressive regimes? These are tough questions. I want each one of you to weigh in on those two questions. Cynthia, why don't you start?
Sure. I mean, I think I'll just kind of emphasize what I said before. I don't think it's not merely a moral obligation, but it's actually, I think, a human rights responsibility for multinational corporations to really assess what human rights harm might flow from their business and from their products and services, including surveillance technology, including filtering technology, and to actively work on a continuous basis to help mitigate that harm. I think that is the duty that they owe to their users and to the people who depend on their product, really, to exercise their human rights in the internet age. In terms of the filtering technology, I think it's a really difficult question, the surveillance technology. And I think some of the same principles apply there as well. If you're selling a product, I think you still need to do that due diligence to say, how might this product be used? Who is the customer I'm actually selling it to? What are the foreseeable harms here? And yes, I think at the end of the day, depending on what the answers to those questions are, it might require walking away from some business if there's a grave risk that they're going to be complicit in human rights abuses. So I do think that is something that needs to be part of the discussion.
Mohamed?
All right, well, if U.S. corporations have a moral obligation, I mean, they're already involved. I mean, I'm thinking of, I don't think that the day they created Facebook, they were expecting that people would be coordinating protests on it, no? But they're, major services of U.S. offered by U.S.-based corporations are very deep into it. Now, how they react to things is really up to each company. Twitter recently, when they came up with their little idea of geo-censorship, certain tweets would be blocked in certain countries on a case-by-case basis after a request of government. And there were a lot of discussion about this, and some of the most interesting thoughts were actually written by Zeynep Tufekci, who was speaking earlier, and just saying that, well, these are such low censorship requirements that essentially anybody can circumvent them. So in that, it seemed to me that Flickr was actually taking a moral standpoint. On the complete opposite is something that Flickr did last year, for instance. Last year in March, Egyptians raided the office of the state security, the Stasi, if you will, our political police. A lot of documents came out of there, a lot of photos. A friend and colleague of ours, whose name is Hussam al-Hamalawi, posted photos of things that he took in there, including photos of officers who were suspected of being involved in torture. And Flickr removed those, sent him an email saying they removed them because of copyright infringement. And everybody's like, that there's something really, really odd happening there. If only who submitted that request to remove these documents that Egyptian had retrieved and why that happened. On filtering technologies, I'll quote a conversation I had yesterday. You don't sell a whip to a slave owner. How, why I fail to see how that is subject to discussion, really. That's it. Thank you.
Let's see, Dunja.
Well, yes, they do have a responsibility. They do have obligation to follow, the way their businesses are working in, different countries where they have, shares. But at the same time, and I'm talking about the experience I had, I think they should not be ignorant to the problems in those countries. Arrogant, as you mentioned. And I will mention the example. Recently, Swedish Public Service Broadcasting aired a program, investigative journalism program about telecom operator in Sweden selling different tools to regimes in Azerbaijan and Belarus, and how these tools are actually helping authoritarian regimes track dissidents, track people. Some of these people I actually met, some in prison, some of them are released now, and they actually suffered because of these problems, because they were listened to their telephones, emails, and I really do not have an answer, who's guilty here, or is it sort of shared responsibility when it comes to the destinies of these people because of certain moves by certain corporations. But I also know that there is discussion, quite serious discussion under EU roof about stopping certain companies selling some of this equipment to the regimes that are seen as the suppressors of their own people.
Sunil, you get the last word.
Yes, they do have a responsibility, and ideally, a large part of that responsibility should be enforced through law. We shouldn't leave it up to them, because through our research, we have been able to demonstrate that there is quite a gap between the values they preach and the values they practice. But I'm hoping that increasingly they will see it as part of their unique selling proposition. Google, thanks to the regulators in Europe, were forced to reduce their data retention practices. And Microsoft went even beyond that, trying to demonstrate that they were providing that as an advantage for their consumers over what Google was. On filtering technology, again, I hope corporations will realize that if they support authoritarian regimes, it undermines the value of their brand in the eyes of their consumers in free jurisdictions. So I'm hoping that to some degree, this problem will be addressed through policy and also through the pressures of the marketplace. I hope consumers will increasingly put pressure on these corporations.
Excellent. So we have about 25 minutes left, and we are looking for questions from the audience. There's a hand here. There was a hand up over there, but let's start with the gentleman in the blue shirt. I don't know, do we bring a microphone to you? How does that work?
There are
microphones in the alleys.
Oh, sorry. Okay, now I see. Okay. If you could step to the microphone, tell us your name and who you're with, and then ask your question.
Thank you all. My name is Mohammad El-Dashan from Syrian Center for Political and Strategy.
Is the microphone working? Let's see.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. My name. Sorry. Yeah.
He wants to read.
Yeah. I want to read from the phone. Okay. My name is Mohammad El-Dashan from the Syrian Center for Political and Strategic Studies. I think there's a shared responsibility. Everybody's responsible in this, but thank you. I think everybody is responsible here because it's the government responsibility as well, multi-billion corporations' responsibility. If I can read from Google blog yesterday about Syria, they unblocked the downloading for 3 softwares and saying, as a U.S. company, we remain committed to full compliance with U.S. export controls and sanctions. it's mainly the US government problem. I don't think Google interested to block their products. They're producing their products to help people and to let them use it, to get benefits from this. But it's Google's responsibility here to push back in the sanctions and to talk to those governments and telling them, hey, your regulation is harming good users. And in terms of the Swedish technology thing, Sweden government vetoed a package of sanctions in the Syrian government only to allow Ericsson to keep going and working there. So there's a trade issue here. And these governments are not using human rights as a condition here. If you respect the human rights, we let you work in our market or not. And one final comment. Sonal,
You have a question too?
Yes, sure. Sonal, I really want to release those people on your flight. So I'm wondering what is the other two demands from the private company?
You want to know what your other demands are.
The demands are. So these two demands were addressed to the private sector. The first is, the second one really, which I already finished the first one, is understanding anxieties of developing country governments. Take the BlackBerry case, for example. I don't think in the international debate it was fully appreciated that when an Indian MP was communicating with another Indian MP, because of the way the topology of the BlackBerry network was designed, traffic necessarily went outside India to NOCs, perhaps in Canada and in the US and perhaps other countries. And those governments could use interception orders there to intercept what should have been really domestic traffic. Now, I don't want to be stupid and say that in the age of cloud computing, we must have a model where network centers are mandated to be hosted within the jurisdiction. That would really destroy the very idea of the internet. But still, if BlackBerry could be a little more appreciative of the anxiety that Indian government officials were voicing, then that would be useful and help that conversation be a little more productive. The final demand is be more transparent about self-regulation initiatives. I heard that there is a private sector company that is now approaching large internet intermediaries and offering to run a blacklist service, which means that if a takedown notice was received for a particular type of content on the servers of a particular intermediary, then those details would be entered into the blacklist database, and then other intermediaries could automatically know whether they should take that content down or not. They don't have to do the evaluation themselves. Bob is looking surprised, but I heard it from one of your colleagues, Bob, so you shouldn't be that surprised. So there are all sorts of new proposals that are being made when it comes to private policing of the internet. And these are very worrying proposals because there is no due process here. And we worry when technical expedience is the driving motivation behind putting together solutions.
Anybody else on the panel want to comment on this? We'll let it lie. Who has a question right here? Yes. We're going to bring you the microphone.
Okay, so it's all very well to raise legitimate concerns about private policing, but we also had very legitimate concerns about what's essentially private policing of the human rights concerns on the private platforms, right? So Cynthia is telling you, the private companies, that they need to be very aware of how their actions affect human rights, which is law, not business. And you're saying, don't do this in certain respects. You're saying, don't take down things on private initiative, don't do things, don't make policies as a private actor, right?
No, I'm saying be transparent.
Okay, you're just saying be transparent about it? You're not saying don't do it. All right, well, that's better. But suppose they're completely transparent about it, and then what? I mean, I'm sympathetic to both of your concerns, but this is the problem, is it not? It's all about how we reconcile this private actor versus public law dichotomy. And
You mind tell us your name and whom you're with?
Oh, I'm sorry. Milton Mueller, Syracuse University Internet Governance Project. So I want to hear some new ideas about how to reconcile that. And I thought if anybody could do that, Sunil, you would be coming up with some new ideas about how to reconcile that. Transparency is good, but what then? So Facebook says, we took down your freedom of expression site because this person asked us to.
Sunil? Anybody else? Sunil?
Yeah, so Milton always asks tough questions. I think the challenge is the formal policy formulation process is not able to keep up with technological developments. So the private sector, to avoid being over-regulated, comes up with self-regulatory solutions. But perhaps there is some role for interplay between those two worlds, ideas such as co-regulation, etc.
What does that mean?
Where once a practice is developed or a standard is developed in the private sector, the penalties or remedies when that practice is violated can be administered by a government official. Or a privacy commissioner, for example, will fine a company because it is in violation of a self-regulatory code. So this whole area of complex regulation, which we didn't need in traditional industries, this is an emerging area, and we're trying to think through many of these questions in India and perhaps in other parts of the world. If the final regime that is put in place passes natural justice tests and is in compliance with international agreements, then we know perhaps we are on the right track. If we arrive at a consensus which fails the test of natural justice, then obviously we have made a mistake. So I can only answer it so broadly and so theoretically, because on each of these issues you have to drill down on what exactly we are talking about, because there is no standard broad prescription that one could make about how to configure this complex system of regulation.
Cynthia?
Sure. Just a couple comments. I mean, it's a very broad question, and I think it presents some of the hardest challenges in this debate. So this is just a couple of kind of thoughts for how to at least mitigate at least some of these issues. First is that all online platforms, user-generated content platforms, they all have terms of service, right? They kind of set the rules of the road for how you can use their service. I mean, one of the things that we try to recommend to companies is when you're thinking about how to develop those terms of service and how to develop your privacy policies, think about use cases beyond the upper middle class American teenager, right? Your service is not being used just by upper middle class American teenagers, but by a global user base or wherever you're operating. And so that case, you need to think through what particular risk profiles might some of your users have and make sure that you design your policies accordingly. And I think that's one area in which some of these tensions could be relieved. And the other thing I want to pick up on the transparency point that Sunil mentioned, I think you said this kind of implicitly, but I think transparency is also important for changing law that might be bad. So the ultimate goal, if there's a bad law that is forcing companies to do something that violates human rights, then I think the ultimate goal should be to change that law. But for advocates, in order to be effective advocates and effective partners with industry, with other stakeholders to change those bad laws, we need to know what's going on to begin with. And so I think that transparency point is really important to underscore.
Milton, does that answer your question? Good enough. Okay. That's a ringing endorsement for the panel. Yes, there's a hand right there. Yes, and we'll bring you the mic. Go ahead.
Thank you. Carl Colapesi, World Economic Forum and the Boston Consulting Group. We've talked a lot about the economics of the internet, and I wanted to ask, we were talking here about internet freedom and what the US government can do. And yet there's a lot of regulation that's currently being pursued by lots of governments, and Sunil touched on this, about regulating personal data and regulating privacy. Are we not in danger of being a bit hypocritical of saying it's okay to regulate personal data and privacy, but not internet freedoms? Aren't they in some ways one and the same thing?
Can you give an example of regulation of private personal data?
Yeah, I mean, actually, Sunil probably knows this a lot better than I do, but there was an example which we actually covered in the World Economic Forum report on the Indian government putting out a piece of regulation last year looking at giving individuals more control over their data about them. It seemed perfectly sensible. And yet, the implication would have been that potentially the entire Indian outsourcing industry would have been affected because they don't have a direct relationship with the individual to go and ask for consent. So effectively, an enormous exemption to this regulation had to be created for Indian outsourcers, which effectively, as far as I understand, Sunil, means that the law is basically non-existent anymore. So we've had a particular piece of regulation that was trying to do the right thing with enormous unintended consequences. So we do need to regulate, we do need to think about what sort of rules we need in the personal data space, but we've got to be very, very careful about the unintended consequences of regulating personal data, which is part of internet freedom.
Sunil and anyone else on the panel, too.
Yeah, so these are perhaps the three challenges with getting privacy policy right. The tension between privacy and transparency, the tension between privacy and free speech, and the tension between privacy and national security. In that case, I'm not sure it's a tension. I call it a false dichotomy. I think privacy is a precondition for national security. And each jurisdiction has to get this right, and perhaps the Indian example is where we got it completely wrong. And also, the trouble is, most of these rights have something to do with power as well. Power asymmetry also has to be addressed. If the powerful, like in the UK, use privacy law to get super injunctions to prevent even the court case from being discussed online, that's a complete abuse of privacy law. What should have ideally been the case is the protection of privacy or the expectation of privacy should be inversely proportionate to power. So the more powerful you are, the less the law protects your privacy. But how do this, according to Professor K.S. Park, this legal theory does not exist. There is some case law from which we can draw this theory, but we need a lot of fresh thinking here in order to balance what are both civil liberties and perhaps competing civil liberties. So I wish I had, again, an answer, but this is all I can offer for now. Sorry.
Anybody else on the panel want to
just
sure.
mention? So it's not just privacy. It's happening around the world. We can see all these initiatives, and I often hear the word, and you just mentioned it, balance. And that is something that really, in a way, makes me not angry, but I can say, I'm really allergic to balance. When we start talking about security issues and freedom, copyright and freedom, privacy and freedom, all these issues are connected, and we are kind of, very much aware of this new medium, internet, but we are suddenly discovering freedoms, and we need to take care of these freedoms by suppressing free speech on the internet. So all around the world, this is happening, and it's proving that we are doing something wrong, all of us, and there is a need to do something globally in order to actually find a way to pursue this issue in the best possible way. It's not easy. It's not easy, but I do not think in this sort of world of global communication that censorship that is happening in India or in Bosnia, my own country, or anywhere in the world is not affecting people in the US or Sweden or Denmark, is something that is not just for one region. And that's why I think discussing this issue at this level is extremely important.
Okay, gentlemen, yes, in the white shirt.
To follow up on that same question, Baron Soka from Tech Freedom. So Sunil, I very much appreciate your point about power dynamics and privacy, especially given that privacy law, at least in this country, and as it was born more generally, was born out of a desire by elite Boston Brahmin to protect themselves and the privacy of their families and their parties from the scrutiny of the public, which we would now call journalism. That was Lewis and Warren and Brandeis' 1890 Law Review article. But I'm not sure that even with your caveat that solution goes far enough to distinguish privacy from censorship. And I have in mind here, in particular, Eugene Volok's 2000 Law Review article about privacy as information control and the troubling implications of the right to keep people from talking about you. And so let me just put the question in a more concrete way and say that it seems to me that there are two visions for how to deal with privacy on the world stage. The US vision is essentially a form of consumer protection, where we look for real harms, which in my view need not necessarily be economic, they could be other harms as well, and we balance those against benefits that are given to users from products that help them, and we try to empower consumers to avoid those harms themselves to the extent they can. And where those things don't happen, or where companies lie, or where there is a power dynamic, such as employers pressuring employees to give up their passwords, we either regulate or we legislate. That's, I think, a good way to deal with privacy. On the other hand, the European approach is very different. It's about privacy as a fundamental right, which ultimately means control, which means censorship. And if that seems overly strong, let me ask you in particular about the Lindqvist case in Sweden, where under the European Privacy Directive, a Swedish woman, just a normal woman in her church, was censored from talking about other people in her church because she was sharing sensitive medical information about the fact that I think some woman who broke her leg and couldn't come to church that weekend. So my question is, how do you, in general on the panel, how do you see reconciling internet freedom with protecting privacy in the way that I think we should and avoiding the European censorship?
All right, let's open that question up to everybody on the panel who wants to.
I can't answer the question because I haven't studied the regimes carefully enough.
Well,
Mohamed?
sorry, I mean, the previous three questions have to do with privacy and transparency, and I mean, in my perspective as an end user, I think that users should have control over their own private information that they choose not to disclose. Now, I mean, you're talking about. You mentioned coercing people to give their Facebook passwords, and it's a bit of an extreme when it comes to forcing someone to disclose private information. I'm against that. Sorry? Good. Sure. I mean, we agree, but that's precisely the kind of thing that we should want to protect, and I think that. So on that, for instance, if we talk about Facebook, we're talking about their privacy settings and how they tend to go always into more disclosure by default unless you opt out. As an end user, I think this is fundamentally wrong, as it goes to first your private information, but also how this information is used / sold to advertisers, etc. So. My personal perspective on it is users should have as much control over their personal information as possible unless they choose to disclose it.
Anybody else? Dunja? Anybody else? Okay. Do we have a question from over here? Did I see a hand? I want to make sure this side of the room is represented. Yes, sir.
Sure. So this is a question. Is this working?
Yes.
Okay, good. About what's that? Oh, sorry, I'm Danny O'Brien. I'm from the Committee to Protect Journalists. And I'd like to ask a question about the American role, both of governments and technology companies, in combating cybercrime and how that might have a knock-on effect in internet freedom. And the example that was kicking around in my head was a demonstration that was given to me by a fairly prominent technology company, which they'd worked on with law enforcement in the United States, that enabled them to take a database of hashes, of summaries of particular files, and in this case they were child pornography files, obscene content, and run that through their storage. So they were people store files on the cloud now, and this would give law enforcement a chance to effectively scan every file that every user had on these clouds and see whether any of them were breaking the law, and pass that on to law enforcement. Now, both law enforcement and this tech company were very proud of this creation that they created, and given the nature of the imagery, pretty much everybody else in the room was happy to see this tech advance as well. I mean, my concern, of course, is how this applies to in other countries where government and law enforcement can't necessarily be trusted to not use that in a civil liberties protecting way, and also the precedent that we've broken there, because I think everybody here would be offended if a program was scanning their own hard drive for images and reporting that to a third party. And yet this was clearly a precedent that no one had worried about searching files in the cloud. So my question is that what do we do when there's a technological advancement that's being funded by American government, being supported by American tech companies, but which has dangerous implications in the rest of the world?
Is
Or
that
even here, really.
For a particular, for anybody?
No, I think that's broad enough for everyone.
Okay. Who wants to jump in? Dunja.
No, it's a dilemma. It's something I do not think we'll be able to answer here today, or I do not think I have some special formula in order to tell you how to tackle this issue. But the thing is, it's not only cyber crimes and cyber security that is affecting, and the way, certain governments are tackling these issues, and if the government can be trusted or not. It's, if we know the answer to this question, probably we will not be sitting here and discussing all these issues. And CPJ is also doing a great job in order to try to have some, I call them short-term successes, in order to help certain people in certain parts of the world that cannot trust their governments. So I do not think, this is different than any other topic that we discussed today. Privacy, issues related to terrorism, and all other issues. So, sorry, I don't think this is a very sort of, something
Mohamed, did you want to weigh? I'm sorry. Excuse me, Mohamed, did you want to weigh in?
Sure, with your permission. Well, Danny, I think like two operative things in what you said. One was whether they're breaking the law, so that's kind of to see whether they're breaking the law. And the question, especially if we're talking about a transnational issue, is whose law? Okay, so is it? So that would be the first one. The second key word you said was child pornography. Now there's something we heard that several times in the past 2 days. And whenever I hear that, I remember one thing I learned from a professor of mine. Was a class on human rights and foreign policy, and what she would keep saying was, you do not legislate on extremes and ticking bomb scenarios. Now, it's very important that we say that, okay, so because we did something that broke into a massive number of people's private files, but hey, it worked because we caught some child pornographers, then we're allowed to use that. So it's very important that we keep that in mind. Child pornography is not the case that we can use. It's an extreme case that everybody agrees that should be fought in every possible way. Doesn't mean that we should legislate and allow for that to happen, because it's a very, very slippery slope. And whether breaking the law, again, whose law? Is it U.S. law? Is it somebody else's law? I mean, what is blasphemous if we, and not? If you go back to my part of the world, a lot of things are considered blasphemous, and a tweet could get you in prison or worse. So I get really, really touchy when it comes to that kind of things.
All right, we're almost out of time. I know some of you do have your hands up. Perhaps you can approach the panelists afterward. I'm going to thank each one of them, but I'm going to give them each 15 seconds to repeat the message that they most want to get across today for you to take away with you. Cynthia?
15 seconds?
15 seconds.
Okay. Well, then I'll just repeat, I think, the two kind of principles that I would really want to push here, which is that really internet freedom begins at home. The U.S. government must set the right example, because governments are watching, civil society is watching, everyone is watching what we do. And finally, for companies, with great power does come great responsibility, and they need to really step up to the plate and start thinking through their responsibility.
Dunja?
Bring internet freedom back to discussions of policymakers and international organizations as soon as possible.
Mohamed?
2 quick points. One, local legislation on internet policy massively affects the rest of the world. And 2, when devising policies regarding the rest of the world, don't be a hypocrite, be consistent.
Sunil?
Can we please introduce some more evidence in this debate that we're having about policy?
Well, you've all helped, I think, contribute evidence and light to the conversation. Please join me in thanking this amazing panel for their wonderful contributions. Thank you, every one of you. Appreciate it.
Nice to meet you.
Is this? Yes, it is. And please join me in thanking Judy Woodruff for being here. You can watch Judy at what time?
6 o'clock Eastern.
6 o'clock Eastern on PBS if you want to catch today's news. So thank you again, panel. We really appreciate it. Brett, did you want to say something? Can we get the mic in the back of the room?
Thanks a lot, Brett Solomon from Access. Thanks a lot for the conversations, and I guess wanted to point out to people who are here that there has been a series of conversations now for a number of years, and I think many of us are meeting in different places, and it's important that the conversation continues, progresses, and then applies in reality. And so the next event is taking place in Rio on the 31st of May and the 1st of June, so people are invited. I think there's probably a couple of dozen people here who are heading down, and certainly an encouragement for people to make sure that they take the voices and the views that are being expressed here. Can I just reflect for a sec on the conference? For me, I think it's important that we be careful that we don't focus too much on fighting the battles and forget the war. I was speaking to a couple of Iranian colleagues the other day who are fighting, .ir email addresses, for instance, but at the same time, the whole sand is shifting. And I was having a chat with Ivan from Global Voices earlier about the meaning of the word cyber and how that language has actually shifted from meaning electronic to now meaning security. So as we fight the battles, I just encourage us all to make sure that we actually look at the whole infrastructure and the war that we're fighting to protect the open internet.
Thank you. Any other comments? All right, I'm going to let everybody go. Before I do so, I have some thank yous to say. First of all, I want to thank all of the participants, the people who sat up here and debated issues, the people who ran workshops, who spoke at workshops, who asked questions and debated during workshops, and the folks who presented their research this morning in the lightning round, which was extraordinarily stimulating and I think people really enjoyed. I want to thank the events people here at the museum, the folks who have been manning the cameras and helping put everything together. So thank you very much. And to our event staff from Google, you've seen Michelle. Stand up, Michelle. Stand up. And Stacy. And they've done just a fabulous job putting this together. A couple of housekeeping things. Of course, I should also thank all of the participants. You came from a long way away, some of you, from as far away as Asia, Europe, Africa, all over the globe. Latin America, I see Eduardo sitting back there. And I really appreciate you taking the time out of your schedules to be here with us and to debate what I think are some very, very important issues. Google can serve as a convener. You all do the work. You all are out there on the front lines doing the research and doing the actual activities. I see Sana and I see Ju here, both of whom are extraordinary reminders of the courage of the individuals who are involved in this movement. I thank you all for being here and for taking part in this. And I'm sure that our paths will cross again soon. We've made each other wiser, I hope, had some fun in the last couple of days. And I know that when we meet again, we will have more subjects to discuss. And hopefully internet freedom will be a little bit more down the road, whether you like the words internet freedom or not. A reminder of housekeeping matters for those of us, for those of you who are not here in Washington permanently, lucky you. The shuttle goes back to the hotel starting in a few minutes, and it will run until 5 o'clock p.m. There are still some buttons left down on the far wall. If you've seen the button wall and enjoyed it, please feel free to strip it bare and take some of that home to those who couldn't make it here. And I'd also ask those people who think they have lost various items over the past few days to check the coat check for your umbrellas, scarves, and God knows whether you've left various mates, partners, who knows what, behind. Again, thank you all for being part of this exciting adventure. Budapest in 2010, Washington 2012, who knows where or when next, but I look forward to it. Thank you again.